Hi, this is Darren from SimNation. A couple people asked me to do a quick recap video for SNCFL, which is our Draft Day Sports College Football 2023 League. Um, we're well into the season. We're approaching week 12, which will run tomorrow night, which means we only have roughly about 5 weeks left of the regular season before we go into championship games, conference championship games, and then bowl games, and then the playoffs. A lot of teams have already locked up their divisions within the conference to determine who's going to win, who will face each other in the conference championship games. We'll kind of run through that. Maryland has retaken the number one spot. Uh, Miami, who's Gary, is in number two. Stewart has moved up to number three with his UCLA Bruins. Louisiana Monroe dropped back one spot because they lost to Auburn. Um, but Skelter still has them in a great spot. Rounding out the top five is Shark with his Georgia Bulldogs. Frankie has the number six Iowa Hawkeyes, who are playing really well. Coming in at number seven is Western Michigan. This is another one of Stewart's team, which is generating a lot of conversation in the league. Excuse me. Mostly because everybody's wondering where Western Michigan's going to end up next season. They've dominated the MAC for maybe one too many seasons, so they're going to move out of the MAC this coming off season. So everyone's trying to figure out where they're going to go. Ultimately, Stewart will get a lot of say in that. Oklahoma State is another Frankie team, one of the leaders in the Big 12. LSU is coming at number nine. LSU won't be able to repeat as conference champion of the SEC because Louisiana Monroe has pretty much locked up the SEC East. Uh, at number 11 is Texas Tech. A little bit of a shock considering how bad Texas Tech has traditionally been, but I'll do a video on them later. I cut 50 players last season, and now they're at number 11 after only winning 4 games last season. Coming in at number 12 is Steve with his Oklahoma Sooners. This is another one of those front-running teams in the Big 12. Boise State comes in at number 13. This is another Skelter team. They've already locked up the Mountain West Mountain Division. So they're just waiting to see who they'll play. Florida comes in at number 14. If I'm not mistaken, Florida is like LSU. They can't win the SEC West. Ironically, those were the two teams that played each other last season in the championship game. So I think it's going to be Georgia versus um, Louisiana Monroe in the championship game this year. East Carolina is a CPU team. They're having a really great season out of the AAU. Stanford displaced Washington State as the winner of the Pac-12 North, so they get the right to face UCLA in the Pac-12 South in the championship game. We talked about Auburn, who's another CPU team. Florida State's coming off a pretty big win against NC State, which may help them get into position to represent the Atlantic. Houston is a good CPU team, so is Clemson. Iowa State and Shark uh, are having a great season again. I know Shark wants to get them up a couple more spots so he can have a shot at the uh, playoffs. I don't think it's going to happen because I think just they have too many losses at this point. Minnesota's Starfinder, he's having a great year as well. If we look at the standings real quick, what you'll immediately notice is that Florida State has largely locked up they have locked up the Atlantic because they have a game in hand on NC State because they beat NC State this last week. So they will win the Atlantic. Miami will win the Coastal if they can get by Virginia this week. Miami's still my pick. I do want to call out Virginia Tech. Bama's done a great job with Virginia Tech this year. 7-4 is nothing to be sad about. Um, just Sample's probably happy that he gets to represent again the Atlantic as the division champion. And then, of course, Fan is at NC State. A little bit of a heartbreaker for him because he had a really pretty good yield going into that game. As you can see, Miami's just pretty unstoppable. They have a 1,000-yard rusher, almost a 3,000-yard passer, and they're just doing tremendously well. You can also see they're recruiting at a very high level. William Rush, I think, was one of the top 5 recruits and recruited this last and is going to FSU. FSU traditionally does a very good job at recruiting. So, big game this week is for Gary taking on Virginia. In the AAU, there aren't many humans in the AAU, so I'm going to kind of breeze through that a little bit. Central Florida with Cable, he's going to get back to a bowl. He's continuing to rebuild after losing McCulloch, who, if you listen to the WWPF, is the quarterback of the Jacksonville Jaguars and has been doing a great job. Houston just having an off the chart recruiting year. So if you want to join the SNCFL, Houston's a great team to take. I do think that East Carolina is probably going to win this conference. Now, Houston really needs to beat Southern Methodist this week, and if they do, then they should lock up the West and be taking on East Carolina, who's already locked up the East. In the Big 12, things are still relatively wide open. I say that because uh, Texas Tech still has a mathematical chance of being able to get into the conference championship game. Of course, they got to beat Texas this week. Not as tall of an order because Kevin's not there anymore. Oklahoma State needs to get by Baylor. Frankie should be able to do that. Steve takes on Kansas State. That'll be a pretty interesting game for West Virginia, who largely has underperformed this season, but I do expect Mike to bounce back, though. Iowa State, they were looking really good. They still have a good record, but they're largely out of the championship game space. But with one game left, there's still a lot of things that could happen that could see them actually make it into the playoffs. Oklahoma, of course, has to beat BYU, so this is Steve versus Starfinder. Shark, of course, is at Iowa State. So this will be a big game for Oklahoma. They've got to win this one. If they lose it, and then lose to Oklahoma State, Texas Tech could find their way into the conference championship game. Steve traditionally is dialed in games he has to win, so I'm not really worried about it. They've only lost one game this season. In Starfinder, while being a really good coach, Oklahoma's a pretty tall order for them at this point. Van is at Kansas. He's lost his last 3. He lost a heartbreaker to Texas Tech this last week. But give it a season or two, and Van will have them dialed in and going pretty well. One of the best running backs in the entire league is Charlie McDougal. He leads the league in points in rushing touchdowns. Uh, he's just having a phenomenal season. And of course, he's getting close to 2,000 yards. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Right now, I don't think my prediction changes. I think it's going to be Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State. Um, Oklahoma has the advantage over Texas Tech because they beat Texas Tech earlier this season. Of course, if Oklahoma State loses another game and Texas Tech doesn't, Oklahoma State could be in trouble because Texas Tech has the game over Oklahoma State. So it'll be interesting to see. It's between these 3 teams now to see who will be in the conference championship. I think all 3 teams will actually make it into the playoffs. Um, but remember, the Big 12, the top 2 teams play in the conference championship. In the Big 10, Maryland has locked down the East again after beating Michigan and knocking Purdue off this past week. Uh, they will play Iowa. Iowa has a game in hand on Minnesota. So it'll be Frankie versus Maryland, which is my team in the conference championship. Iowa's just got to knock off Northwestern to essentially just make it a formality. Maryland needs to get by Missouri, sorry, to just continue to position themselves for a number 1 seed. Ohio State, DP's got them back on track. He just needs to get past Texas San Antonio. He should win that one relatively easy. Stanford, which is Skelter, comes into town to play Michigan State. They should win that. And then those are really the big games. Fang is probably having one of the better seasons out there. Timothy Greenwood is a really good wide receiver out of Ohio State. You'll probably hear him in the WWPF. Um, Kind of a little bit of a shock is that Wisconsin landed Ryan Cooper. Um, Not something that I could have foreseen, and if I remember correctly, Wisconsin is Barry. So great job, Barry, in grabbing the #1 overall recruit. Maryland, of course, is taking all the five-star quarterbacks they can find, which is probably why Ron Baker's starting to play better for them. It's because he's suddenly realizing he's going to be competing against three other five-star quarterbacks. Maryland is definitely dominating the recruiting scene right now. Conference USA, North Texas shows last season wasn't a fluke. They'll be back in the conference championship game. And really, when you look at the East, it's nobody really wants it. Old Dominion should be in there, so it should be Old Dominion versus North Texas. My money would be on North Texas. Lee Vigil is someone to keep an eye on. He's a really, really good wide receiver. And again, Florida Atlantic, who is controlled by a human coach, is just doing a phenomenal job recruiting, um, much better than they did the previous season. So, if I remember correctly, Florida Atlantic is JP, so he's going to have a good pinning for next season. And of course, Florida Atlantic this week plays Old Dominion. Florida Atlantic isn't really going to get into the playoffs, but again, if they do beat, I'm sorry, not the playoffs, into the conference championship, but if they do beat Old Dominion, they would reopen up that whole uh, race to where potentially they could sneak in. Independence, let's just go past those. MAC, I mentioned Western Michigan at the top of this. One, they're recruiting really well. Two, they are just dominating the conference. Centron is one of the better quarterbacks. Hollow, of course, is one of the best running backs. It's a formality at this point. They've won their division. They're going to win the conference too, and it's just a matter of how high they'll be in the playoffs. So there's really nothing to talk about there. That's stars. Fresno State is Starfinder, if I remember correctly. Not the season he wanted, but he'll get that turned around at some point. The real story here is Skelto at Boise State. He was cussing about them last year, but he's turned them around, and they're just having a phenomenal season. One of the reasons is McMurray. So where they're at right now, as long as they don't lose a game that they really shouldn't, and they only have one game left, they should make the playoffs. They'll likely face Nevada. Well, they will face Nevada uh, in the conference championship. So my money's still on Boise State for that one. Pac-12, Stanford will take on UCLA. That's already determined. Um, Washington State isn't going to make the playoffs, which will be a big shock because normally they're in there. But Stanford needs to win out and then beat UCLA in order to make the playoffs. They still could not make it. The leading rusher in the SNCFL is Ricky Merriman out of Washington State. So even though they're not having a great season, he's still having a great season. He's already broken the 2,000-yard mark with one game to spare. Uh, Probably another guy who will break the 2,000-yard mark is Richard Harper out of UCLA, and he's a major reason why they're doing so well. So as you can see, the recruiting is dominated by UCLA, so Stewart's just reloading at this point. Big games this week: UCLA versus Colorado. This will be a rout. Stanford versus Michigan State. We talked about that. Arizona State. Gary's starting to upload again. He won one game, so I do look for Arizona State to start moving in the right direction. SEC. We talked about this one as well. Is as there's not a way that Florida wins. I think if I remember correctly, Georgia beat Florida. I need to look at that just real quick before I say what I'm about to say. Yeah, so there's no way that Florida can beat Georgia for the SEC West. So the SEC championship game will be Louisiana Monroe versus Georgia. So this is Shark versus Skeletor. There's a strong chance LSU and Florida can both find their way into the playoffs since as long as they don't lose a game that they shouldn't lose. Jansen's the big thing with LSU this year. Ashby hasn't been as good as he was last season. But again, as you can see, Louisiana Monroe's just had a really good season. They're doing well in recruiting. Alabama's had a bigger week. Auburn has been knocking off all the great teams and losing to the bad teams. So they lost to Texas A&M. They lost to Mississippi. Those are really their two losses. Versus they beat Louisiana Monroe, LSU, and Georgia. So they'd love to add Florida to that list. We talked about Maryland versus Missouri already. And then the final conference is Georgia Southern is DWK. Not quite the season he was hoping for, but they're in a good place to be at 5-7. They probably won't make a bowl, but it's a good way to end the season after what was largely a disappointing season for them. And they brought in some pretty good recruits. Uh, from a recruiting perspective, right now, I want to say Maryland is probably number one. We'll check that real quick. Um, this may take a second. Uh, from a commit wise, yeah, Maryland's at number one. They have 9 5 stars. UCLA's at number two. UCLA could actually, I don't think UCLA can jump over them because I think they're done, whereas Maryland is not. Miami is up there and could catch Maryland. Bama probably isn't going to. The big thing with Maryland, of course, as you can see, is they've cornered the market a little bit on quarterbacks, tackles, and are really doing well with the number of 5 stars they have. League leaders, uh, if you want to join the league, Cincinnati is a really good team to look at. So is Baylor. They both have the two of the three leading passers. The human controlled teams, Jesse McIntosh out of Virginia Tech is the highest human ranked team on that list. Touchdown wise, Ron Baker out of Maryland's having quite a big good season. Quentin Bach out of LSU is also having a good season. So is Jesse Payne out of Miami. QB rating wise, um, actually I need to click this because it'll get all that noise out of there. Jesse Payne is number two. He's having a really, really good season. I forget, I think he's a junior, yeah. He's someone who you could potentially see in the WWPF. Really needs to come back to have a good chance of getting drafted high. Merriman is probably going to win the rushing title again this year, but we're probably going to see at least 4 running backs break the 2,000 yard mark with Harper, Jansen, McDougal, and Merriman. Um, and Merriman, of course, this will be his third straight 2,000 yard rushing season. So it'll be interesting to see how he builds out given the fact that they won't be in the playoffs this year. Rushing touchdown wise, I mentioned McDougal. He's just having a great season, scoring touchdowns. Receiving wise, Timothy Greenwood is the top human controlled wide receiver. This is a guy who, when he does come out, whether it's this year or next year, should be one of the top wide receivers in the class. Receiving touchdown wise, Bittner out of Maryland is one of the top scoring wide receivers. Again, he's another junior, but he's someone that I think will also potentially, when he comes out, be one of the top wide receivers in the league going in. I'm sorry, top wide receivers in the draft. Sack wise, this one is interesting to me that we have quite a few human teams here. We don't normally have that, but Gene Hamilton out of Oklahoma State is having a really good season. He could actually win the sack leader competition. Interceptions wise, Florida State's Reed Metcalf is having a tremendous season. Definitely keep an eye on him. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Where we're at now is there are only a few conferences that are still open for competition. Most of the conference championship games have already been determined. So like the Big 12 is still open between three teams. The Big 10 isn't. I think the Conference USA with the East is the only other one that's really big that's still outstanding. So most teams now are just fighting for playoff position or just trying to make sure that they get into a bowl. Um, and it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the season pans out. But I definitely think one of the biggest games coming up is going to be Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State, because I think that that game is really going to determine ultimately who's in the championship game in the Big 12. Oklahoma, of course, has some wiggle room, so does Oklahoma State, but Oklahoma State has to win that game. Otherwise, Texas Tech, if they win against Texas, could sneak into that game. So that's it for now. If you have any questions or want me to cover a specific topic, let me know. But hopefully you like this recap video. And the next sim will run tomorrow night. SNCFL runs its sim on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Definitely, if you want to join us, take a look. I'll have the links in the video. And thank you for your time. Bye.